Welcome to another episode of the MMA Lockcast. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, your boy on social media at MMALOTN, and the architect behind the MMA Fight Archive, ensuring you leave no stone unturned for these upcoming MMA events. We recently surpassed 4,500 fighter profiles. Yes, you heard that right. 4,500 plus fighter profiles for you to browse through, spanning 17 different promotions from all over the world, and ensuring you have as many direct links to past fights for all these fighters so you know exactly what to expect when they step foot in the cage. This weekend alone, we have ACA 181, Cage Warriors 179, UFC Edmonton, and Fury FC 98 going down. And then again, the rest of November has a ton of other great promotions and events going down, and we have direct links to past fights for all the competitors on there. We update this pretty much every single day, so we're as up to date as you could possibly be with all these matchups. And in case there's ever a late notice dropout, more often than not, we already have the replacement fighter on the archive. So even if it's not updated on the actual schedule itself, just type in the fighter's name and you can find that fighter's profile and get to studying ASAP. That's why the Fight Archive is absolutely booming right now. We also surpassed 100 plus subscribers as well. So shout out to everybody that's been supporting the movement there. And again, you can try it out for free with a 7-day free trial. Check the link in the description below for you to try it out. Like I said, 7 days for free before you even shuck out a penny. Make sure you guys check it out and take full advantage, especially if you love doing your own researching and breaking down fights. This is the best way to do so. All right. This weekend, we got UFC Edmonton going down, headlined by a flyweight matchup between former champion Brandon Moreno taking on rising contender Amir Albazi. In the co-main event, we have a 5-round flyweight women's matchup between former champion or former strawweight champion Rose Namajunas as she takes on Blanchfield, who is looking to bounce back after her first UFC loss at the hands of Blanchfield earlier this year. As you would expect, a Canadian card is filled with Canadian talent. So you have the Charles Jourdain, you have the Jasudavicius, the Siri Cities, the Marc-Andre Barriault, the Chad Anheligers on the card. But there's 14 total fights to break down for you guys, and I'm very much looking forward to doing so. I want to do a quick recap of UFC 308 this past weekend for the lock of the night. We actually went with the parlay, which I don't normally like to do, especially with the UFC cards. Normally with Bellator PFL, I don't mind making a parlay my lock of the night play, but considering what we had on deck for last weekend's card, I felt more comfortable going with the parlay. So obviously, we had Fareed Basharat in there, and he went out there and did the damn thing against Victor Hugo. And then Lerone Murphy having a much closer fight than I expected him to have against Dan Ige. But credit to him for being able to bounce back in the second and third rounds to pick up that decision victory in cash as a lock of the night play for us. We also had a lock of the night play for LFA 195, which we pretty much swept on the card. Great play, 3 underdogs we were able to hit as well. But in terms of the lock of the night play, that comes through for us as well, with Kevin Fernandez around minus 200. So that now brings our lock of the night record to 76-37 on the year for a 67% hit rate. And then for our dog of the night play, we went with Darren Elkins last week, and he came through for us. Or sorry, it was not Darren Elkins. I apologize. I still have my notes from last week on here. It was actually Max Holloway. And I'm glad that it was Max Holloway, so I can talk about the Holloway and what was the other fight, the co-main event, the Robert Whittaker picks that I had. I know those are highly criticized predictions. No matter how the rest of the card goes, and even the fact that I finished the event in the black, people are going to rip me for making those predictions. I was liking how the Holloway fight was going. Obviously, he was only up on he was tied on one scored card going into the third, and that's where we normally know that Holloway starts to get stronger. But credit to Ilia Topuria. He was continuously able to crash the pocket, land his big strikes, and then obviously do the unthinkable, at least in the form of Max Holloway's career, which has never been done before, and that's to go out there and knock him out. And I was very surprised that Topuria was able to do it so effectively. Not very surprised. Obviously, I took a shot on Holloway due to the wide odds there, and feeling that his range management and his ability to continuously stick and move would be able to help him. But shout out to Ilia Topuria, man. This guy continues to go out there and knock out high level names. And this is never a guy that I've tried to say was all hype or anything like that. If you guys have been watching me for a long time now, I've been calling out Topuria way back since his Cage Warriors day. I think he only has one fight under the Cage Warriors banner anyway. But I was surprised at his quick ascent and then obviously his ability to defeat guys like Holloway and Volkanovski in the manner in which he did. Shout out to him, credit to him. And then the Chimaev fight, again, great defensive work from Whitaker, which we knew was going to be obviously the path for Chimaev early in that fight. You can't really call a guy, having his teeth pushed in as a method of him losing a fight. But credit to Chimaev for getting the job done there. So I'll take those losses on the chin. Shout out to everybody that was all over the chalk on those guys. All I say, even if you do not agree with my picks, I'm not looking to completely swing you on a pick or anything whenever I do these prediction videos. It is all to just open your mind to the other side. If you take my points into consideration and you still don't agree, that's fine. We can have a civilized conversation about these things, and I'm completely okay with that. There's going to be times where I get the roll of dice. So a couple weeks ago, people were shitting on me for taking Paul Hughes against AJ McKee. That comes out on my side. And I'm happy about that. And I'll wear that, very happily. But when the L's go my way, the L's hit me, I'm going to take it on the chin. It's completely fine. That's the game. We break down, 45 plus UFC events a year, 40 plus UFC events a year, PFL, Bellator, and all the regional shows I call. I'm not going to be perfect, but I will stick to my process. And it has been working out very well for me, especially this year, a career year for me, if you want to call it that. But again, I will not tolerate uncivilized discussion in the comment section. I will not tolerate people just talking shit and saying you suck at predicting all of that type of shit. Bring some civil arguments my way, and I'll be more than happy to chat in the comment section regarding those points that you make. And again, sometimes I'll get it right. Sometimes you'll get it right. We move on, and there's always an event to talk about the following week. And that's how it should go on. But it's never going to be that way. It's the YouTube world. It's the YouTube comment section. It's always going to be filled with some guys that are boasting a little bit too much. And that's fine. Doing this thing for 6+ years now, I've gotten used to it. It's cool. So, like I said, Dog of the Night play does end up falling short here with Max Holloway. But we did cash on our Dog of the Night play for LFA. I can't remember off the top of my head. I think it was Dante Skiro who cashed at plus 160, closed at plus 110. Very happy to hit that over former UFC fighter AJ Fletcher. And that brings our Dog of the Night record now to 44-75 for a 37% hit rate. I'm still a little bit fired up about the Holloway argument that I just had, but it's all good. There's your recap for that. Quick plugs for the Lock of the Night Patreon page, the MMALOTN Patreon page. Obviously, got all the UFC Edmonton content up there already. The track plays, Lock of the Night play, Dog of the Night play, all that good stuff. But we also have ACA and Cage Warriors going down Saturday morning as an appetizer to the UFC Edmonton cards. So if you want breakdowns for those in written form and track plays for those, you guys can check out the MMALOTN Patreon page as I'll have it posted there. I'll be getting to work on that later on this evening, but should have it done by Friday, well in advance of the Saturday morning showtime for both of those events. And then shout out to GodzillaWins.com for providing your boy a platform to drop written content on a weekly basis for free. On Thursdays, we drop the main event breakdown, and on Fridays, I drop the top 3 money line spots for every UFC card. So make sure you guys check it out. That is GodzillaWins.com. There you guys go. All right, 14 fights to break down for this UFC Edmonton card. Like I said, a ton of Canadian talent sprinkled throughout this card. I believe all the males went winless back at UFC 297 in January in Toronto. Let's see if we can flip the script and at least be better than 500 this time around. All right, first fight actually takes place in the women's flyweight division, and it goes down between Jamie Lynn Horth, who comes in at minus 210, going up against Ivana Petrovic, who comes in at plus 180. Starting off on the Horth side, she suffered her first professional defeat last time around as she went up against Veronica Hardy and ended up losing a split decision. I thought Hardy clearly won that matchup, winning about 8 minutes of that action with her striking and speed advantage, but also her ability to grind and land some takedowns and get some control time. Horth came on strong in the last 7 minutes of that matchup as she was able to get takedowns and solid aggressiveness with striking of her own, but unfortunately it was too little too late for her and she ended up losing on the scorecards there. Prior to that, she won her UFC debut against Hailey Cowan, utilizing a solid package of mixed martial arts, mostly with their physicality and aggressiveness, dictating the pace of that matchup and having success in the clinch and the wrestling realm, which is where she normally gets her best work done. She's usually one of the taller and bigger flyweights on the roster with how she commands respect and commands the pace of each fight with her forward movement, with her clinch, and with her strength, grinding opponents to the ground and doing big damage from that top position. Her opponent this weekend, Ivana Petrovic, was able to pull off her first UFC victory in her second attempt last time around as she had a classic Na Liang matchup. Na Liang was able to win the first round on all three scorecards, but ended up falling off with her cardio, as she always does, allowing Petrovic to take over in the second round and then eventually get it finished in the opening minutes of the third round. Petrovic is a fighter that is decent all around, but I think she is best when she's able to apply her grapple-heavy approach. Unfortunately for her, that worked against her in her UFC debut against Luana Carolina, who was able to take her to the ground, grind her out through the first 2 rounds of that matchup, and do enough in that third round to eventually win the fight on the scorecards. Petrovic, to me, is a little bit overrated from the resume that she was able to build on the regional scene, and I think we're slowly seeing what her ceiling is inside the UFC, and I think this week will be a good tell for both fighters to see whether they can actually have a longer career in the UFC or if they're going to be in and out within 3 or 4 match fights in their UFC stint. I do lean with the Canadian fighter here, but I do think that the line is a little bit wide. I think Horth will be able to have the advantage with her physicality and being able to take this to the ground and grind out Petrovic, but Petrovic might have some skills and a level that we're not completely aware of, and this will be a good matchup for her to be able to showcase that. But unfortunately for her, I still think that the physicality of Horth will end up being the difference maker here, allowing Horth to dictate the pace of this matchup, pretty much fight the fight that she wants in the positions that she wants, and that should be enough for her to grind this victory out. But again, minus 210, a little bit too wide for my liking. But I'm going to pick Horth and Horth by decision. All right, next up, we got a bantamweight matchup here between Chad Anheliger, who comes in at plus 160, going up against Cody Gibson, who comes in at minus 185. Now, we'll start off on the Anheliger side, who was able to pull off an upset victory last time around against Christolampos Grigoriou, probably butchering that guy's name anyway, but regardless, a good win for Anheliger there as he dealt with a grapple-heavy approach early from Grigoriou and then eventually was able to take over in the second and third rounds as his opponents started to slow down, blow his gas tank trying to go for desperation takedowns, allowing Anheliger to defend effectively and then land damage of his own to end up getting the victory on the scorecards. That allowed him to snap a 2-fight losing streak where he actually had a submission loss to Jose Johnson and then also a fight where he lost to Alatang Haili, who was able to outstrike him and outdamage him over the course of 15 minutes. And Anheliger is a guy that likes to put big pressure and big power punches on his opponents, but he's a little bit slow at times, and his grappling defense leaves a lot of openings for opponents to take advantage of him in those spots. Hence why I think Grigoriou took that grapple-heavy approach, not knowing that he would not have as much success, which ended up costing him his gas tank and then eventually losing the last 2 rounds of that fight. Anheliger, 37 years old, I don't think he's too far off his 38th birthday either. I think that's at the beginning of December. But again, lack of speed, lack of athleticism, and mainly just having knockout power and an ability to have good cardio. That's usually been his calling card and his way to win matchups. His opponent, Cody Gibson, was able to pick up the first win of his second stint with the UFC as he was able to go out there and submit Brian Kelleher earlier this year. And I think that was a great example of what Gibson could look like at his best. He normally showcases a slick boxing approach, but he is also a wrestling coach. And you saw that on full display against Kelleher, landing a couple takedowns and eventually wrapping up an arm triangle choke when Kelleher made a mistake, gave up the position, and was forced to tap. Prior to that, we saw a loss for Gibson against Miles Johns, and even against Brad Katona in a matchup where he was an absolutely barn burner of a matchup, actually. Both guys trading shots back and forth, but Katona managed to just edge him out late in that matchup and end up winning the scorecards. Luckily for Gibson, it was a good enough performance that the UFC still decided to bring him back to the UFC, even though he lost in the finale of The Ultimate Fighter. So, like I said, solid boxer, getting up there in age, 37 years old. But I think the Brian Kelleher fight showed us that he can be still very competitive and still show off a lot of his skills. In this matchup against Anheliger, I think he has Anheliger covered everywhere. I think Gibson is the better, more technical striker, and I think Gibson's wrestling advantage here should allow him to dictate the pace of this matchup and put Anheliger in bad positions that he won't be able to work out of. He might be able to get back to his feet every now and then, but I think that we'll see Gibson do a good job in terms of meshing his boxing with his wrestling to dictate the pace of this fight and where it takes place. So I'm going to go with Gibson here. I think he grinds this fight out, as Anheliger is normally very difficult to put away. But yeah, I really like Gibson in this spot, and I think he wins it on the scorecards. All right, another bantamweight matchup here as we have Sidey coming in at -155, going up against Garrett Armfield, who comes in at +135. Starting off on the Sidey side, he was in a lose-lose situation last time around, taking on Ramon Tavares for the second time. Now, if you guys remember, he won on the Contender Series against Ramon Tavares, but it was an early stoppage by the referee that caused Dana White and the UFC brass to put this rematch together after Tavares was able to pick up a victory a few weeks afterwards that lost, getting signed to the UFC, and then matching these two up once again. Tavares missed weight pretty badly for their rematch back in January, and it seemed he was a little deflated in the second and third rounds, but luckily he was able to bust up Sidey in that second round, even though it seemed like Sidey won that round from a larger scope, in my opinion. I thought he landed more damage, had Tavares on the back foot the entire time, was commanding the cage, landing nasty combinations, but the optics of the blood that was just pouring out of the face of Sidey was working against him there, which ultimately called for two judges to score the second and third rounds for Tavares, respectively. One judge, I think, had it. All three judges had round 1 for Tavares. One judge had round 2 for Tavares, and one judge had round 3 for Tavares. But I thought a lot of people agreed that Sidey should have won the second and third rounds by dictating the pace in those rounds, landing the better shots, and landing better combinations too. The kid is a nasty striker, and you obviously saw that on display when he first got that victory over Ramon Tavares, but also the knockout victories he's been able to produce on the regional scene in Canada. His defensive grappling has very much improved since the first professional loss that he suffered at the hands of Matteo Vogel, who's a high-level BJJ black belt. But Sidey has shown his takedown defense since that matchup and just battering opponents on the feet. His opponent, Garrett Armfield, is coming off of a submission loss to Brady Heastand earlier this year, and that was a fight where I felt very good about Armfield going into that matchup, but it seemed like he was unable to keep up with the relentless grappling pace of Heastand, and that caused Armfield to slow down, ending up with him giving up the submission in the third round of that fight. Prior to that, he was able to defeat Brad Katona in Canada, actually back in Toronto, back in January, the night that Sidey took his UFC loss, debut UFC loss. But Armfield showed some good defensive grappling work early, but was unable to deal with it in the second and third rounds, causing him to slow down and end up giving up that submission. Armfield is a solid grappler in his own right, has an improving striking game as well, which allowed him to win those first two rounds against Brad Katona. But I think if they ended up rematching, I think Katona would come with a slightly better game plan, and that would allow him to edge out Armfield and actually win that matchup. Now, this is a fight between striker versus grappler, in my opinion, and I think we're going to see Armfield try to implement the grappling here to keep Sidey away from his striking, which is clearly where the Canadian has an advantage. I think I will believe enough in Sidey's defensive grappling improvements here that he should be able to stop the majority of Armfield's advances and then really batter him on the feet, especially in the second and third rounds as Armfield starts to slow down. -155, I think, is a fair line here for Sidey. I do have a little bit of a hold up in terms of getting major confidence on the Sidey side because, Armfield is probably the best grappler that he's faced since he lost to Matteo Vogel, so this will be a true test and a perfect spot for Sidey to prove to us that he has made the effective grappling improvements that he needs to be competitive in the UFC, but I'm going to believe that he has, and I do think he'll be able to touch up Armfield here, and I think that could lead to him getting a TKO in the second or third round, so I'll probably be honing in on those round props as well for Sidey, which I last saw, I think was around +900 and +1200, so give me Sidey and Sidey by a late knockout here. All right, heavyweights going at it here as we have Alexander Romanov coming in at plus 100, going up against Rodrigo Nascimento, who comes in at minus 120. Now, interestingly enough, when this card was initially announced, it was Alexander Romanov scheduled to take on Derek Lewis, but the UFC decided to throw an audible and eventually matched up Romanov against Nascimento, and then Lewis ends up getting Jonathan Diniz, which will go down later on in this card. Now, Romanov is coming off of a submission loss to Jailton Almeida in a matchup where he was unable to deal with the grapple-heavy approach right off the bat from the berserker style of Almeida. That now puts Romanov at 1-3 in his last 4 fights, and far from the high-level prospect that a lot of people expected him to be, with the nasty start that he had to his UFC career, finishing his opponents, taking them to the ground and just smashing them outside of that weird win that he had over Juan Espino. We know Romanov's game likes to take opponents to the ground, smash them quickly, get them out of there, or he starts to slow down and opponents are able to take over. I was very surprised with his decision victory over Blagoy Ivanov, but it seemed like the threat of his takedowns allowed him to muzzle the offense of Ivanov, and that allowed him to just outstriking him and fight the fight at his pace, so he was able to see the scorecards and end up winning the fight there. His opponent this weekend, Rodrigo Nascimento, is coming off of his first main event in the UFC, and it was a knockout loss at the hands of the Black Beast, Derek Lewis, and that was a matchup where Nascimento had a very hot start, getting some good top time, getting some good damage off, but unfortunately it started to fall off in the second and third rounds, which is where Lewis was eventually able to get that knockout victory. I still believe Nascimento at 31 years old is capable of making it into the top 8 of the division. Decent striking. He has a very good ground game as well. I think he just succumbs to guys that have big knockout power, or guys that are able to clip him perfectly, like we saw against Chris Dawkins in his first UFC loss. Nascimento, again, I still think is quite talented. He just needs to be a little bit more defensively responsible in the striking realm, and then he should be able to at least outwork most of his opponents, whether by outstriking them with a good enough pace, volume, and output, or out-grappling them and doing good work with his jiu-jitsu game. Here against Romanov, I do think that Nascimento might face a little bit of danger early, but I think he is good enough off of his back to stay calm and eventually either work back to his feet or survive long enough to eventually get this fight back into the striking realm. And then in the second and third rounds, I think Romanov will struggle to dictate the pace, which will cause him to give up some bad shots on the feet and allow Nascimento to really put the work on him and eventually get him out of there in the second or third rounds. So I'm going to go with the Brazilian here to overwhelm Romanov and get the stoppage as Romanov's gas tank goes on empty in rounds 2 or round 3. All right, next up, featherweight matchup here between Jack Shore, who comes in at plus 205, going up against the streaking Youssef Zalal, who comes in at minus 240. Now, I'll start off on the Shore side, who suffered his first professional defeat at the hands of Ricky Simon back in July of 2022. That was a fight where he ended up getting clubbed and subbed, but he did manage to bounce back with a submission victory over Makwan Americani, but unfortunately last time around he suffered a loss at the hands of Joe Anderson Brito, a very weird loss where he was actually the fight was stopped due to a nasty cut on his shin, something that we've never really seen before, but apparently that the judges and the doctor actually believed it was damaging enough that the fight should not go on, and it didn't really seem like the momentum was really going to shift back in Shore's favor, because it seemed like the athleticism advantage and physicality advantage of Brito was causing a lot of trouble for Jack Shore. Jack is a guy that normally likes to rely on a relentless grapple-heavy approach, wrestling his opponents to the mat and keeping them on the ground, and he's usually pretty effective in doing so. His striking is very rudimentary, a lot of straight shots down the pipe, likes to stay active with the kick at times, but his best path to victory is normally getting opponents to the ground and grinding them out and keeping them in those bad positions. It really just seems that he comes up short against guys that have a huge physicality or power advantage over him, just as guys like Ricky Simon and Joe Anderson Brito did. But that has put him in a spot where the public seems to be very low on him, hence why he's such a big underdog here in a fight where I believe should be a lot more competitive. He goes up against Youssef Zalal, who's currently on a, I believe, 6-fight winning streak or 5-fight. Yeah, it's a 5-fight winning streak. He got cut from the UFC after picking up 2 straight victories and then 3 straight victories and then going 0-3-1 in his last 4 fights. Got cut, then went right back to the regional scene, picked up 3 first-round finishes, and got signed right back to the UFC and took on Billy Quarantillo and finished him by submission in the second round. He followed that up with another submission victory in the first round over Jarno Aarons earlier this year, and that just showcased that Zalal has clearly made improvements from the first time that we saw him in the UFC. This is a guy that has taken in a liking to being a little bit more aggressive, staying active with the leg kick, and then eventually getting into the grappling realm, whereas jiu-jitsu has looked very good, getting the back of his opponents and looking for submissions. And I think that's the switch that he needed to turn to really take it to the next level. Now, in this matchup against Jack Shore, sure, he's the better, Zalal is the better striker. His movement is probably going to make it very hard for Shore to get the clinch and grappling positions that he needs to be effective. But I still think that the odds are just way too wide here. Zalal doesn't have the physicality or the athleticism advantage as much as guys like Ricky Simone and Joe Anderson Brito had over Jack Shore. I think Shore will obviously eat some damage here, but I think that he'll be able to close the distance enough that he can eventually get enough grappling situations going that he can get that grind going and keeping Zalal on the back foot. What has hurt Zalal in the past is guys that come with grapple heavy approaches, and he did fight a grapple heavy guy in Billy Quarantillo, but I have long stated that I'm not a big believer in Quarantillo's wrestling abilities, whereas Jack Shore, I think Shore is a much better wrestler than Quarantillo. And then being able to chain wrestling attempts together, scrambling very well too. I think Shore can do a good enough job in terms of making this fight very, very close. Again, I wouldn't be surprised if Zalal gets like a club and sub position here, considering all of the movement that he likes to implement. But if Shore can cut off the cage effectively here and get to his wrestling, I think he's going to remind people why he was able to put together a 16-0 record over his first 16 fights, because he is that good in the wrestling realm. So I'm going to go Shore here. I think Zalal is going to be tough to put away. So I'm going to go Shore and Shore by decision. And again, got to take recency bias into consideration here and have to take the odds into consideration. And I think Shore is more than worth a shot at this line. All right, next up, the bantamweight debut of Charles Jourdain, who comes in at -120, going up against Victor Henry, who comes in at +100. Now, we'll start off on the Charles Jourdain side, who is on a 2-fight losing streak, most recently getting knocked out by Gene Silva back in June, I believe it is, and that was a fight where he was pretty much outpowered and outmuscled the entire time. Jourdain is a guy that also likes, or mainly likes to lean on his unorthodox striking approach with his flashy kicks and combinations, but against Gene Silva, Silva had him flinching about 2 minutes into that matchup because of the power in which he was landing with, which ultimately led to that second round finish. Jourdain can be outstruck by better strikers, as we saw in the Gene Silva and Sean Woodson fights. He can be outgrappled by guys that are good enough in the grappling realm, like Nathaniel Wood and even Shane Burgos, who was able to get some grappling success there. Controversial decision, but still, to see Burgos get as much grappling success as he did in that fight, pretty much lets you know what you need to know. But then Jourdain has shown some good defensive grappling in the form of utilizing a nasty guillotine, which he caught Ricardo Ramos in his last victory. He also caught Lando Venata with the same thing as well. So you have to be very wary if you're looking to take Jourdain to the ground, because instead of utilizing the traditional defensive grappling or defensive wrestling that you would see with the sprawls and digging underhooks, Jourdain is going to latch onto opponents' necks and try to utilize that to either get a submission victory or create a scramble so that he can get back to the striking realm, which is where he feels most comfortable. Now, this cut down to 135 pounds at 32 years old, I don't think is the best thing for Jourdain. He's not a huge featherweight, but he's probably going to be a big bantamweight, which is going to cause him a lot of issues in terms of his durability and his cardio, especially facing guys that are going to look to be pushing him and take advantage of the fact that he's cutting to such a lower weight class. His opponent, Victor Henry, 37-year-old veteran here, coming into his 31st professional fight. I think that he has the chops to cause Jourdain some troubles here. Now, Henry's coming off of a TKO victory over Hani Yahya. Doing what Victor Henry does best, a lot of lateral movement, a lot of output, good wrestling, good scrambling as well, very well trained, never been finished. Very solid fighter all around. And I think that this is a horrible stylistic matchup for Charles Jourdain, especially in his bantamweight debut. I think we'll see Henry push the pace. I think we'll see Henry shut down the unorthodox striking nature of Jourdain. And I'd be surprised if Henry gets caught in any sort of guillotine, as I do think we'll see Henry actually take a grapple-heavy approach in this matchup to contain Jourdain and keep him in bad spots. I really think Jourdain's going to need a Hail Mary guillotine to be able to pull off a victory here, but that's going to be very tough against a guy as well-trained and somebody that's never been finished like Victor Henry. So kind of surprised to see Henry as a slight dog in the spot. I think he's the better overall fighter. He's going to cause Jourdain a ton of issues, and that should lead to Henry end up winning this fight and likely winning it on the scorecards. Next up, women's flyweight matchup between Ariane, formerly Lipski, apparently it's De Silva now. She comes in at plus 190, going up against Jasudavicius, who comes in at minus 225. Now we'll start up on the De Silva side, who is coming off of a decision loss to Karine Silva, and that snapped a 3-fight winning streak for De Silva, as she was able to go out there and defeat JJ Aldrich, Melissa Gatto, and Casey O'Neill, showcasing her improved takedown defense, her defensive grappling improvements, period, but also her striking, which has usually been her calling card throughout her career. She's kind of been a bit of a bust since coming to the UFC in 2019 as the KSW flyweight champion, and she never really met the potential that a lot of people expected of her, but we did see glimpses of it during that 3-fight winning streak that she was on. Unfortunately, all the defensive grappling improvements that we have been seeing from her may kind of be outdone by the lack of grapplers and lack of wrestlers that she was fighting, and I think the Karine Silva fight may have proved that to us last time around. Silva was able to win the first 2 rounds with her grappling, and even though she lost the 3rd round on the scorecards to De Silva, Silva was still able to get the grappling going and get some good control time to end off that fight in the last minute to minute and a half, showcasing that De Silva can still be put in those bad spots. De Silva at her best is utilizing her defensive grappling to keep fights in the standing realm, where she usually has an advantage, utilizing her combination striking and nasty kicks to damage her opponents or even choose to finish them. Jasudavicius seems to be really turning her corner. Even though her losses to Tracy Cortez and Natalia Silva are weighing on her UFC record, she now finds herself on a 2-fight winning streak with a finish over Priscilla Cachoeira back in January, and then a dominant decision victory over UFC newcomer Fatima Klein, who is a highly touted prospect from the regional scene. It is worth noting that Klein took that fight on short notice and up a weight class, and it seemed like the size advantage of Jasudavicius caused a lot of issues for Klein in terms of getting any success of her own. But what Jasudavicius is best at is her relentless wrestling and chain wrestling style that keeps opponents in defensive positions and allows them, Jasudavicius, to break them and either find finishes or grind them out. More often than not, she's grinding opponents out. Her submission victory over Cachoeira is a bit of an anomaly, but I do think after that loss to Tracy Cortez, we're going to see a little bit more aggressiveness from Jasudavicius, and we kind of saw it in the Klein fight, even though she was not able to get the finish. We saw some nasty elbows from her, and she was making a more concerted effort to establish positions where she's able to posture up and rain down big shots, specifically with her elbows, to cause damage and cause the referee or the judges to see rounds more dominantly in her favor. In this matchup, obviously, Jasudavicius will be at a slight striking disadvantage, but I don't think that's going to cause her a lot of issues in terms of crashing the pocket and getting this fight into the grappling realm. I expect her to flub on her first couple of takedown attempts, but she will chain them together and do a good enough job in terms of keeping De Silva fighting, whether it's off the cage or off her back. But I do think Jasudavicius will get enough control time and damage from that top position to eventually win this fight on the scorecards. A little bit chalky here, but I think the Canadian defends home soil and gets a dominant decision win here over Ariane De Silva. So give me Jasudavicius and Jasudavicius by decision. Our next up, bantamweights going at it here as we have the streaking Ayman Zahabi coming in at minus 120, going up against Pedro Munhoz, who comes in at plus 100. Now, starting off on the Zahabi side, after his loss to Vince Morales a couple years ago, he did take some time off, came back in 2021, got a win over Draco Rodriguez, and then was able to pull off 3 more straight victories over Ricky Tercios, Arichi Lang, and Javid Basharat. He's been an underdog in all of those fights, and the biggest underdog in his last fight against Basharat. It was a bit of a slow start for Zahabi, but in the second and third rounds, he was able to use a tactical striking approach to counter a Basharat effectively, land some big shots, even wobbling Basharat a few times, and eventually winning that fight on the scorecards. It was a close fight, especially in those second and third rounds, but I thought you could really see the clear shots being landed from the Zahabi side, which ended up allowing him to win that fight on the scorecards. People forget, Zahabi was a highly touted prospect coming into the UFC. Unfortunately, a 1-2 start through his first 3 fights kind of fizzled out that flame that a lot of people had for him coming into the promotion. Obviously, his brother, famous for being the head coach of Georges St-Pierre and the TriStar Gym out of Montreal. So there was a lot of high expectations for Zahabi. But I think that he is catching on to that potential a little bit too late at 36 years old. He may not be able to knock on the door of contendership, but he can try to make a damn good run at it considering he's on a 4-fight winning streak now. His opponent this weekend, Pedro Munhoz, is on the opposite of having a good winning streak, as he is actually on a pretty tough run as of late. Last time around, we actually saw him take a very Pedro Munhoz-like approach. He went 1 of 8 on takedowns against Kyler Phillips, but you'd have to go to the previous 11 fights and accumulate all those takedown attempts to get 8 takedown attempts from Munhoz. Normally, Munhoz walks his opponents down, batters the calf of them, and utilizes wide-winging hooks to land his big power to either knock his opponents out or beat them on the scorecards with the optics of just moving forward and landing better strikes. Unfortunately for him, just things have not been going all that great. He's 2-6 in his last 8 fights and currently rides a 2-fight losing streak as well. It's clear that the younger, faster guys are going to get the better of him. And if he can do a good enough job with a better technical striking approach, you could still get the better of him. Seeing him beat a guy like Chris Gutierrez makes you wonder if he still has those types of higher level performances in him. But in this matchup against Zahabi, I think he's going to be up against it. Zahabi is a very talented and experienced striker, especially with the come up that he had with his brother, who is known for his striking prowess as well. I think we'll see Zahabi do a good enough job in terms of utilizing that forward pressure against Munhoz, landing better strikes, sticking and moving well enough, and really thwarting the forward pressure of Munhoz. At -120, not a bad line to take a shot on Zahabi, and hoping that he can continue this Cinderella run and seeing if he can actually pull off a victory in the first fight where he'll be a favorite in his last 5 fights. So give me Zahabi here, and Zahabi by decision. And again, Munhoz, 38 years old, not a really good look either. All right, next up, welterweights going at it here as we have Mike Malott looking to bounce back from his first UFC loss, coming in against veteran Trevin Giles, who's trying to snap a 2-fight losing streak. Now we'll start on the Mike Malott side, who had a very strong first 2 rounds against Neil Magny back in January at UFC 297. It seemed that night the UFC was ready to put a jetpack on Malott and get him into contendership, especially if he was able to defeat Magny. Unfortunately for him, some of his rookie mistakes came into play, which allowed the veteran Magny to take advantage and eventually get the victory with 15 seconds left on the clock. Malott utilized a striking heavy approach, landing 17 of his total 22 kicks in that first round, hoping to debilitate Neil Magny so he can land some big shots on the feet and knock him out. Unfortunately, the knockout didn't transpire, so we saw Malott go to his grappling in the second round, and when he was unable to get a submission there, he really started to slow down in the third round, allowing Magny to battle back into that fight and turn on the jets in the third round and get that TKO victory. I thought Malott would have been much better served getting the fight to the ground immediately so that he can get to his submission game, which likely would have gotten Magny out of there a lot sooner and not have to worry about that cardio dump that ended up costing him later on in that matchup. Now, Malott is a guy that I've been following for a long time, 13 years now. He actually competed for a card that I was closely involved with in his 4th professional fight, and he was an absolute killer back then. We couldn't get anybody to fight him. We eventually got a journeyman to fight him who ended up getting knocked out in less than 90 seconds, and then from there, Malott had his ups and downs, but I'm happy that he finally ended up making it to the UFC. Nasty striker, nasty grappler, has some good experience training over there at Team Alpha Male, being a coach over there for those guys over the last several years, and really taking his MMA career a lot more seriously at this stage of his career. But that loss against Magny is going to cause him to reevaluate things and see if he can bounce back effectively. The UFC is not doing him any favors by throwing a guy like Trevin Giles at him, who is very experienced and a veteran and could potentially pull off the similar type of success that we saw Neil Magny have. Now, Giles is on a rough run of his own where he's, I believe, 2-4 over his last 6 fights. Last 2 fights he's gotten finished by prospects Gabriel Bonfim and Carlos Praches, but he was winning that Carlos Praches probably about 7 out of the 8 minutes of that fight, utilizing his jab and his fast hand speed, his footwork, blitzing inside the pocket, landing his strikes and getting back out before getting damaged. Unfortunately, he ended up getting caught by a straight left near the ending of that second round, which caused his lights to go completely out. Now, Giles is one of those fighters that has a huge skill set, a huge tool bag of skills and techniques. And we see him fighting at a very high level in a lot of his matchups. But unfortunately, sometimes his durability comes into play, and that's where opponents are able to make him pay and eventually get him out of there. If his durability is more reliable, he's a fighter that could definitely break into the top 15 and even be in the top 10 given his striking alone. He is a BJJ black belt. He scrambles well, has some good submissions, but it's really his striking with his 1-2s down the pipe and his speed that has made him so dangerous throughout his career. I thought it was going to be hard for him to settle at welterweight, but he's been doing very good as of late outside of getting finished from Bonfim and Praches. In this matchup against Malott, I do think the line is just far too wide here, similar to the Jack Shore fight earlier in the earlier on this card. But in this matchup, it really comes down to the durability issue of Giles. If he can stay conscious in this fight, he can completely wear down Mike Malott and actually finish him in the second and third rounds. Malott has a ton of power in his shots, but I do think Giles has the solid speed advantage here. And if Malott looks to take this fight to the ground, Giles is good enough to thwart any of that type of approach that Malott will be bringing to the table. So I have to go against Giles. And I got to say this, if there was any fight and any matchup that you could accuse me of having any bias whenever I do these predictions, this is the fight. I should, with my bias, be choosing Mike Malott. I love the guy. I've had conversations with him. He remembers me from back in the day. But stylistically speaking, too big of a favorite here. And I do think that Giles is just a more crisp striker, and that could allow him to really bust up Mike Malott. I plead with you guys to go back and watch the Carlos Praches fight. Praches, I believe, is a better striker than Mike Malott. And we saw Giles just bust him up for 7 minutes and then eventually get caught. Malott needs to get that finish earlier on in this matchup. Otherwise, I think he's going to be far too behind, and Giles will be safe enough in the striking realm to continue to get to his shots and maybe even find a finish of his own. So I'm going to go Giles here. I'm going to go Giles, probably second or third round finish. Take advantage of this wide line. I do think Giles is the spot in this fight. And it hurts me to say that. I'm a big Mike Malott fan. Win or lose, this is going to be bittersweet on either side. I'll likely have action on Giles, but I'm going to be hoping for Malott to win because as a Canadian boy and as somebody that's been following Malott for as long as I have, I want him to win, but I have to take advantage of these odds on Giles as I do think he's the better overall fighter here. All right, next up, middleweights going at it as we have Marc-Andre Barriault coming in at minus 180 going up against Dustin Stoltzfus, who comes in at plus 155. 1 second. All right. Starting off on the Barriault side, who's on a 2-fight losing streak, most recently getting knocked out by Joe Pyfer at the ending of June. Now, that's where my concern starts right off the bat here for Barriault. He got put out pretty bad by Joe Pyfer just 4 months ago, not even 4 months ago. Let me just quickly say here. Yeah, it was 4 months ago. How can you approve a guy like Barriault getting right back into action after having his lights turned out so quickly last time around? Again, so recently. Barriault is a great fighter. Usually his durability is not too bad. This is a guy that likes to weaponize his cardio and his pace and his output by wearing opponents down and finishing them late, or at least winning on the scorecards and getting his hand raised there. But I'm not a fan of him returning so quickly, even though this fight is taking place in Canada. And of course, the UFC wants to stack this card with Canadians. But this is a fight card that Barriault should have passed up. And I get it. He's 34 years old. His career is slowly winding down. Maybe this is an opportunity he could not pass up. And it's a very winnable fight, hence him being the favorite in this matchup. But you have to be very concerned about his durability coming into this fight. High output, high pressure, high cardio. Barriault breaks his opponents in the clinch, wears them down with dirty boxing, some nice knees up the middle as well. That's usually the name of the game for him. For Dustin Stoltzfus last time around, he's been alternating wins and losses over his last 5 fights. Last time around, getting brutally knocked out by Bruno Ferreira after having major success of his own leading up to that knockout. We saw Stoltzfus have some grappling success, but also hurt Ferreira a few times before he eventually walked into a spinning back elbow and then another one, which eventually put him out in that fight. Stoltzfus is a solid all-around fighter, a BJJ black belt if I'm not mistaken, and has set up shop at Extreme Couture over the last year after originally training in Germany for the majority of his martial arts life, honestly. Stoltzfus, underrated fighter. I think the Punahele Soriano fight showcased that to a lot of people. But I think if Barriault's durability holds up here, this is a matchup where Barriault can do a good enough job in terms of outworking Stoltzfus keeping him on the back foot and keeping him pinned up against the cage, wearing him down and potentially finishing him in the second or third round. I really like Barriault in the spot to go out there, do a good enough job in terms of performing his game, but unless his odds start to come down to that minus 150 range, I'm probably going to have to pass on him here because of the durability issues that I spoke about earlier. So give me Barriault by TKO in round 2 or round 3. The under 2.5 at plus money, not bad either. Next up, the light heavyweight debut of Kyle Machado, coming in at minus 160, going up against Ribeiro, who comes in at plus 140. Now, both these fighters are looking to snap a 2-fight losing streak. For Machado, it was a decision loss to Don'Tale Mayes in a fight that he only had himself to blame, as he could have done a little bit more to actually get his hand raised that night. He was having a little bit too much fun, smiling and clapping hands with Don'Tale Mayes throughout that matchup, but his coaches should have reamed him a little bit more in terms of getting his head in the game, considering how close that matchup was. And I think he only had himself to blame at the end of the day there. I'm not a huge fan of the coaching staff that he had in Vancouver training for his first couple of fights. I thought his Contender Series matchup was a very abysmal showing, mostly from his opponent, who did absolutely nothing that night, allowing Machado to just cruise to a decision victory and end up getting the decision there. Lost to Mick Parkin. We can give that pass to Machado. But considering what I saw from Machado on the regional scene, the Don'Tale Mayes should have been Mayes fight should have been a fight that he could have easily won had he just put his foot on the gas a little bit more. He's a BJJ and black belt, BJJ and kickboxing and Muay Thai as well, if I'm not mistaken. And he seems to have the aggressiveness when he really chooses to fight. One thing that I like that he's done in the lead up for this matchup is he's actually gone back down to Brazil. He is a Canadian citizen, as he just got his citizenship after being in Canada for about 9 years, but he is Brazilian by birth. And I think that going back to the gym that brought him up, or at least from that area that he was originally brought up in, training with Inside Muay Thai, I believe is the gym, alongside a UFC fighter, Ariane Carnelosi, a couple of other regional fighters there fighting for LFA that are on the come up as well. Machado may be tapping into that aggressiveness that he's needed this entire time to try to find his first UFC victory. Good aggressiveness when he really turns it on. Good enough cardio, especially for a former heavyweight. It's going to be interesting to see him really in shape now at light heavyweight. He was never a huge heavyweight, especially with some of the weight that he could have lost. And it'll be interesting to see him really in shape for this matchup. And if he taps into that aggressiveness that has given him success in the past. He goes up against Ribeiro, who has shown very bad fight IQ through his first 2 matchups in the UFC. His first one against Ming Yang Zhang got knocked out in about a minute and a half in that fight, when he should have leaned on his grappling to really get that fight into a place where he could be more comfortable and get off on his damage. But he chose to strike and end up getting knocked out. Then his last matchup against Magomed Gadzhiesulov, choosing to grapple with the grappler. And even though he had success in the first round, a lot of it coming from the calf kick that he implemented afterwards, he ended up gassing himself out and allowing Gadzhiesulov to do what he wanted in the second and third rounds to win that fight without too much issue. Ribeiro is very dangerous with the power and explosivity that he has. He has a good wrestling game and grappling game where he needs to rely on it. But it really comes down to the level of opponent he's going up against and the style of the clash that's happening to decide whether he should be striking or grappling with these guys. Should he have stuck with the striking right off the bat against Gadzhiesulov, he could have knocked him out. Should he have stuck with the grappling with Ming Yang Zhang, he probably could have submitted him or at least gotten a TKO on the mat. So he is talented. Just bad decision-making, in my opinion. Now, in this matchup, tough to really be confident on either side. I do have to go with the Machado side because I do think he's a little bit more well-rounded. I do think he'll be the better striker, although Ribeiro might be a little bit more dangerous in terms of finding the finish. But I think the big question mark comes with how Machado will actually look at 205 pounds. Is it going to be too much of a cut for him? I don't think it will be. He looks in tremendous shape. It looks like it shouldn't be too bad of a cut for him. But also, both guys not looking great as of late, and I can't really get behind either betting line for either guy here. Maybe there is a little bit of value on Ribeiro at plus 140, but I do think Machado is the overall better fighter here. If he comes in with the right mindset, this is his fight to win, and I think it's going to be one where we see him outpoint, outstrike, and maybe even out-grapple Ribeiro to win this fight on the scorecards, but I got to pass all in all here. All right, next up, Derek the Black Beast Lewis coming in at plus 145, going up against the streaking Jonathan Diniz, who comes in at minus 170. Now, I'll start off on the Derek Lewis side of things, who was able to buck a 3-fight losing streak, a 4-fight losing streak, I believe it was. I lied. 3-fight losing streak between 2022 and 2023, and has now 2-1 over his last 3 fights, including a main event knockout victory in the 3rd round over Rodrigo Nascimento earlier this year. I believe that fight was back in May. Derek Lewis, showing off some nifty tricks in some of his fights as well, showing off some a nifty trip that he had on Nascimento in the 1st round of their matchup. But a lot of his success, we know, comes with the power, comes with the ability to blitz the pocket, whether it's the 1st round or the 5th round. This guy can always find his way into the pocket to land big strikes and try to knock opponents out. At 39 years old, we know the name of the game for him. Doesn't really have much off of his back. When he decides he wants to get up, he'll just get up without using any proper technique. He has some sneaky reversals, as we saw against Rodrigo Nascimento last time, but it really comes down to his energy reserves. Usually when he's on his back, he does a good enough job in terms of surviving so that once he's able to get back to his feet, he has enough energy stored that he can blitz attack his opponents and get them out of there quickly due to the power that he possesses. I doubt he gets back to a title shot of any sort. I doubt the UFC ever cuts him, even if he ends up going on a 5-fight losing streak, just because of his popularity and his ability to just pull off a victory at any given moment. Lewis, we know the name of the game for him. Now, he's going up against a much better technical striker here in Jonathan Diniz, and we saw him utilize an improved defensive grappling game last time around against Carl Williams to keep the fight in the striking realm, where he's able to batter him for about the first 10 minutes, showcase good enough defensive work in the 3rd round, and do enough to not get finished when Carl Williams found himself in a dominant position with about a minute to go. Diniz usually does a good job in terms of dictating the range with his output and with his footwork, which has allowed him to snuff out most takedown attempts from his opponents, so he can keep fights in the striking realm and outland them there and not chase knockouts, but kind of just let them happen. He's finished 7 of his 8 wins by knockout, but again, if you watch those fights, he's not really chasing knockouts. He's putting his combinations together, he's walking his opponents into traps, and if those traps manage to hurt and drop his opponents, that's where he'll usually look for the finish and get them out of there. But he is not looking to overextend on spots for his opponents to catch him slipping, land a counter, land a takedown, and that's where you end up having to fight, uphill again when his opponents are able to take over by taking advantage of him overextending. Now, in this matchup, you got to believe that Diniz is going to be able to touch up Lewis from distance, kind of thwart his big power attacks, but it's always a coin flip with Lewis. He can land a big shot and end the night of his opponents, but he also leaves a lot of openings for a technical genius like Diniz to really counter him effectively, chop away at the lead leg of Lewis, slow him down tremendously, and then from there start to land his shots down the pipe and beat him there. I have some concerns in case Lewis looks to actually get this fight to the ground, not with the traditional takedown attempt style that we've seen from Carl Williams in the past, but more so from the clinch, where we saw Lewis land some sneaky trips and throws against prior opponents. And we know when Lewis is able to establish dominant position and posture up, he can get some fight-ending shots down in ground and pound form. But I'm not completely impressed with Lewis's ability to control opponents on the ground, and especially with the urgency in Diniz's game nowadays to really work back to his feet, or at least work to a position where he's not going to be eating too much damage from his on his back. I think it's going to get harder for Lewis to have any success in that realm. So it comes down to Lewis crashing the pocket, landing his big strikes, and hoping one of them is enough to put Diniz on skates and eventually follow up with big shots after that. But still have to lean with the more technical fighter here. Not so much so to the point that I'm going to actually be playing the minus 170. I do think Diniz just better overall fighter here, much better striker, and that hopefully leads to him eventually getting a finish here, probably in the 2nd or 3rd round. I'll keep my eye on this line. If Diniz drops to minus 130, I'll probably take a shot there. But I'm minus 170. I'm going to have to end up passing here and just predict him to win this fight by knockout. All right, 5-round co-main event going down in the women's flyweight division, as we have Erin Blanchfield coming in at minus 135, going up against Rose Namajunas, who comes in at plus 115. Now, last time around for Erin Blanchfield, she was in a main event slot in Atlantic City as she took on Blanchfield, and she was unable to get any of her work done, ending up getting swept on the scorecards and battered over the course of 25 minutes. Now, if you just look at the stat line and see that she only attempted 3 takedowns, a lot of people might blame Blanchfield for not having more takedowns takedown attempts, but you have to credit Fiorot's game. She was doing a great job in terms of utilizing her range, her footwork, and her lateral movement to keep Blanchfield from being unable to close the distance effectively enough to get a good enough clinch situation or takedown situation to even get to her game where she would have had a tremendous advantage over Fiorot on the mat. We know Blanchfield has a lot of struggles in the striking realm, and that's where opponents in the past, even if they weren't able to defeat her, were able to get the better of her. JJ Aldrich, we saw Jessica Andrade have a little bit of success there too. It's all about Blanchfield getting fights to the ground, building that bridge, and then eventually having success from that top position where she's very good with submissions and she's very good with control. Here against Namajunas, who's on a 2-fight winning streak now after losing her flyweight debut against Blanchfield, we are seeing the improvements in Namajunas in terms of her defensive grappling and her urgency in terms of getting out of bad positions so she can either get back to offensive grappling of her own, which we've seen her start to lean on a little bit more at this stage of her career, but also her technically disciplined striking game, which has allowed her to knock out opponents like Weili Zhang and Joanna Jędrzejczyk in the past. Namajunas, I do think, has the edge and most advantages in this matchup. Obviously, if Blanchfield is able to get the fight to the ground, it's going to be very tough for Namajunas to get off on much success of her own. But given that this is 5 rounds and given the improvements that we've been seeing from Namajunas with her defensive grappling, I am willing to give her a little bit of a shot in terms of at least winning 3 of these 5 rounds. You know, whether that's getting taken down, eventually working back to her feet and then getting to her striking, or even just completely shutting down the takedown game of Blanchfield and just touching her up on the feet. I think Namajunas is worth a consideration as an underdog here. Blanchfield is still 25 years old, still trying to bridge the gap between striking and grappling, especially against high level of opponents. And if Namajunas continues to showcase the defensive grappling we've been seeing as of late, there's no reason she can't win this fight. So I'm going to go Namajunas as the underdog here, plus 115, hopefully fending off most of Blanchfield's grappling advances and just outpointing her out, striking her on the feet, and getting her hand raised on the scorecards. That brings us to our main event, which goes down in the flyweight division, as we have former champion Brandon Moreno coming in at minus 175, going up against Amir Albazi, who comes in at plus 150. Moreno came up short back in February in a rematch against Brandon Royval in a fight that he lost by split decision. But I'll be the first to admit that I was very surprised at the amateurish approach of Moreno in that matchup, relying heavily on an overhand to try to land enough damage on Royval to get the win. After the majority of his grappling attempts failed, he was resorting to just a very predictable striking style that Royval was able to pick up on and counter effectively, but also land more damage, land more output, and end up winning that fight on the scorecards. It was a very weird performance from Moreno, who just seemed a little bit over fighting at that time, and it seemed it was true considering he decided to take some time away, hence why he hasn't fought since February of this year. It's interesting, and it will be intriguing to see what kind of fire, if at all, Moreno has coming back into the fray here, especially going up against an undefeated UFC, somebody that's undefeated in the UFC, in Amir Albazi, and a guy that's clearly positioned himself to fight for a title should he be able to get the win this weekend. But Moreno, if he's able to get back to the winning track, obviously he'll be able to make a case for himself, especially considering that when he lost his title to Alexandre Pantoja, it was by split decision and it was a very close fight. So I think just getting a dominant win, or even just a win at all against a top 5 flyweight at this stage of his career, could warrant Moreno another title shot. And again, we have to remember that Kaya Sakura, UFC debutant, is getting a title shot in the flyweight division in December. So Pantoja is already scheduled, but we know that the next contender is still TBD. But Moreno normally showcases a very slick boxing game, good hands, good hand speed, doesn't just rely on overhands like he did in that matchup against Royval. His defensive grappling has improved tremendously, which has led to that resurgence that he had when he returned to the UFC. Obviously, a guy like Pantoja was able to take advantage of that because of his BJJ prowess, but for the most part, Moreno does a good job in terms of stopping defensive approaches from his opponents and then getting back to his own offense with grappling, or most often than not, his striking, which has allowed him to either finish opponents like he has against Davison Figueiredo and Kai Kara France, or just touch them up and defeat them on the scorecards. But his 5-round experience is going to be very crucial, especially going up against Amir Albazi, who will be looking to fight a 5-round fight for the second time in the UFC after a split decision victory that he got over Kai Kara France in June of 2023. He's been on the sidelines ever since, dealing with neck injuries, but also waiting for the proper opportunity to fight somebody that will give get him that much closer to a title shot, and who better than former champion than Brandon Moreno? Albazi is best when he's able to get his grapple-heavy approach going, where he has some decent control, but he does start to slow down later on in fights, which leaves him a little bit susceptible in the striking realm, and it causes him to shoot desperation takedowns, which opponents are able to take advantage of for the most part. I really thought, and a lot of people thought, that Kai Kara-France deserved to win that fight over Amir Albazi, winning rounds 1, 4, and 5, but for some reason the judges actually ended up scoring that fight in Kara-France's favor. Albazi was able to get some good control time, specifically in the second and third rounds, but I thought Kara-France was able to outdamage him and outwork him in those other 2 rounds. In this matchup, I think we'll see the defensive grappling of Moreno really show off here, especially his cardio advantage, which will play heavily in his favor later on in this matchup. I think Moreno is clearly the better striker, and if he gets back to his combination style, throwing a diverse variety of strikes, that's going to cause Albazi a lot of trouble here. Look for Albazi to have a little bit of success earlier on in this matchup with his grappling, but if Moreno can keep a high enough pace, provide enough resistance that will cause Albazi to work, that's where we'll see Albazi start to slow down later on in this matchup, allowing Moreno to turn up the volume in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th rounds, landing the better strikes, maybe opening up a club and sub opportunity for himself if he's really able to turn up the volume and hurt Albazi. But I think this fight ends up going to the scorecards, and I do think we see the former champion break that 2-fight losing streak that he's on and get his hand raised here and returning successfully with a decision victory over Amir Albazi. Give me Brandon Moreno by decision. There you guys go. Breakdowns for all 14 fights for this UFC Edmonton card, which goes down this Saturday. Reminder, there are 2 cards that serve as an appetizer to this UFC card, as we have ACA and Cage Warriors going down Saturday morning/afternoon. I will have written breakdowns for those on the Lock of the Night Patreon page. If you're interested in that, check the link in the description below. Otherwise, I will see you guys again tomorrow for the top 3 Lock of the Night candidates and the top 3 Dog of the Night candidates. See you guys then. Peace.